Welcome to Momentum Session 1. Today's session, or this session, is all about phase 1 of the Momentum program, which is called Acceleration and Coherence. But before I jump into it, just a quick recap of what Momentum is. Momentum is a planning framework developed to help marketers, media, and advertising leaders make better decisions and deliver improved commercial outcomes. And just a quick reminder, when we break that sentence down into its kind of key parts, the first part is one, it's absolutely focused on solving problems. That's our big kind of key job in marketing, advertising, and media. We face numerous problems all the time, big, small, tricky, not so tricky. So building that problem solving muscle is an absolutely critical part of this. The second part is it helps leaders make better decisions. So for one, it helps frame better decisions. It helps support and build a case for better decisions. And most importantly, build a case for endorsement of those decisions so they can progress forward, which is ultimately what we all want if they are the right answer. Lastly is, again, commercial outcomes. This is rooted in helping businesses sell more things. I can't be sort of more blunt than that. Its goal is to get to the heart of why someone's not buying something, what's getting in the way, how we get a prospective customer to do something, or how we get an existing customer to do more of it. So it's very much rooted in helping businesses sell more things. It's not a sales program by any means, but it's very mindful that its purpose is based around commercial impact. So that's Momentum in a nutshell. What are we going to cover today? Well, we're going to cover acceleration and coherence, what that means, setting the scene of kind of why, the journey around answer first problem solving, the different process stages that acceleration and coherence goes through, and then we'll introduce some of the kind of key parts of that. So the brief, that's not a typo, that's a that's a term. The gut answer, the immersion stage, the answer on a page, refinement of the answer, and then finally endorsement of the answer. So that's what we're going to go look through. So there's a bit to cover. I will be totally honest, I'm not a graphic designer by any means. So I've designed these materials, but by no means are they aesthetically beautiful. And the templates within, I've done the best of my ability in terms of making them as functional as possible. So don't let the form take priority over the function. They're very much sort of functionally led documents. But if you want to redesign them, make them look better for your own purposes, then absolutely do that. I'll also be doing a little bit of sort of marking. So if you see things like this on the screen, that's sort of where I'm trying to draw attention to something. So you might see a bit of that, especially if there's things that have multiple elements and I'm trying to raise awareness of something. So let's get into it. So what is meant by acceleration and coherence? Well, acceleration is really simple. It's about making fast progress towards generating the answer. I think one thing that I have probably become more mindful of as my career has progressed is the benefit of making fast progress and making progress really early. In many consultancies I've worked at, they're very conscious of that first 24 hours, really demonstrating progress and getting deep into the problem while it's just been handed to them. And that's something that I've sort of have always felt advertising agencies can learn from, because I think it shows a real sense of urgency. I think there's a real excitement around a problem in that early stage. And sometimes if that problem is sort of set to the side and kind of picked up a bit later on, or it's sort of a little bit kind of done in conjunction with a whole bunch of other things, the urgency and the good that comes with that can sometimes be lost. So fast progress, I think, is good. I touched in the earlier session. The speed of consumers, the speed of competition often means that it's a mandatory anyway. The market's not going to wait for you to get to the problem. The problem is there. If the problem is pressing, you need to deal with it. Coherence is the quality of just being logical and consistent. So when you combine these two, you want fast, rapid progress towards generating an answer, and you want that answer to be logical. You want the thinking behind the answer to be consistent, and you want the case that you build around the answer to be really robust. So the first phase of momentum, which is really kind of in a perfect world, happens and is completed 1 week, maximum 1 week after receiving the brief. So it's about breaking the back of a problem in a fast, logical, consistent way, forming a really strong answer, getting endorsement from the client on the answer. You can get those things done in the first week. That is fantastic. And then, as the name implies, momentum is always about moving towards solving the problem. So you're very conscious about doing things that build upon solving the problem. One of the most frustrating things I think I've found is when people put ideas forward to solve a problem, and you'll get someone who's, will just dismiss it offhand. That's not going to work. And what can happen is that you have the germ of an answer, you have a fragile kind of building blocks of an answer, and it's kind of smashed up and it's replaced with nothing. So I think it's fine to constructively critique an answer, but I think if you do that, you've got to be really mindful of building on what that is, and either using it to bring something else in that is better, or build on the deficiencies of the answer so that they don't no longer exist. If you sort of smash something to pieces, all anyone's left with is nothing, and I think then it will really deter people from coming up with answers and ideas if they think they're going to be discounted kind of straight off the bat. So what does a successful acceleration and coherence phase look like? Well, for one, you've identified the problem, and you've really gotten to the heart of what that is. So I think in briefing, you get given a problem. Sometimes there's an underlying problem that is creating that need. Sometimes there's multiple kind of underlying problems. But you really want to get to that kind of absolute thing that's causing the problem, or the problem itself, in order to be able to develop an answer that addresses that. So developing a credible, robust answer is critical. And I think momentum sets a relatively high bar on doing that. And I'll run through sort of how that's done. But I think it's not meant to sort of, I guess, self-censor answers. But I think it really, you've got to have a lot of conviction in what the answer is. And I think if there's low conviction in an answer, this sort of process really finds it out. You want to engage the decision maker and achieve endorsement to proceed with the work. Simple, a great answer that's not endorsed is kind of a theoretical answer that never really goes anywhere. A really great answer that's not endorsed can be for multiple reasons. Could be not so great answer. It could be just it's been badly expressed. But I think we're in the business of getting ideas made. We're in the business of generating answers and executing answers. So endorsement is super key, and so there's a focus on that. I've built these process maps along the phase. They sort of look like train stations, and then what we do as we go through is sort of, I've got these guides you'll see on the next slide in terms of how I'm trying to signpost, but you sort of see these, and here you've got receiving the brief, generating problem statement, gut answer, etc. We're sort of going left to right along these areas. Now, this is really kind of major gates you need to get through. Some of these can happen quite quickly, and some of these don't require endorsement. But they're all sort of things that ultimately we kind of break down, from getting a brief to getting endorsement. These are probably the least sort of set of stages that I could work through. There's a lot of steer codes, or the mention of steer codes. I think steer codes are something that I'm a big fan of. It's basically a steering committee with the client. I think a steer code, there's never really a bad one, but it can really kind of flare out an idea. It can get you on track if you're off track. And it's a really good way of getting closer to the answer. and by the answer, I mean an answer that's going to be acceptable for everybody. I think if you don't do steercos, or you take a brief and then you present it back, say 3 weeks later, without a heap of consultation, it's quite a high pressure environment for the person who's having to approve it. It's a really high pressure environment for you as well, who's done the work, because if it doesn't get approved, you're kind of all stuck. Whereas it's much easier, I think, to do steercos, and one, it will get rid of a lot of unnecessary work, and then I think two, you're bringing someone along the way, and so they're as often as invested, if not more, than you are in it, and you and your team is. So I encourage steercos in terms of steercos with a client, with a decision maker, and then you'll see in the next process, the next step, really encourage steercos with collaborators, partners, team members as well, when you're translating the answer into action. So, receiving the brief. Now, this is every problem starts with a briefing. Now, briefings can take numerous different stages or formats. Sometimes you'll get a formal brief, a piece of paper, and it will have a bunch of information on it. Sometimes you'll get a corridor chat, or a lunch chat, or a call, or something. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be here you go, Ben, here's a brief, it's due on X date, I have this amount of money. I think you're listening to see if there's a problem that is being expressed to you that you can use this process to solve. A lot of the work I love doing is hearing, hearing between the words for a problem, and then sort of coming up with a quick answer and saying, we were chatting, you mentioned XYZ, got me thinking, what about blah? And they might say, oh, that was just an offhand comment, that was a flippant comment, or okay, that's interesting, can we have a bit more of a think about that? Or hey, you misread it, it was actually really about this, or whatever it is, right? But often those can be the most interesting things to work on. And on the other hand, if somebody gives you a formal kind of structured brief, sometimes there's a lot of things that aren't said in that you can bring out, or sometimes you can help build on maybe what that problem is, and go through this stage. So the format is really, ultimately up to you or the client, or however you choose. So, but what I'd say is you don't generally have to wait for the brief. Sometimes if you know a brief is coming, and you've worked on a client for a long time, you probably know what it's going to say. You may not know the specific kind of minutiae, but in terms of crafting an answer, you probably know enough to kick off with it. Some people, like I say, like structured briefings. Others will be more comfortable with a verbal briefing. Some will be a mix of the two. Again, no set way. But in my experience, a lot of the critical, or most of the critical information kind of generally isn't, say, included in the initial format component. Sometimes a formal brief can be a bit rigid, can be a bit wooden in terms of what it's willing to say, and it can be quite a sort of factual observation of a current state, which is not to say that's not helpful, but there's often a lot that is unsaid that is quite helpful, and some of the art is trying to tease that out, or find ways to get that to present and guide that, and we'll go through what some of those are. The most important thing, I think, in this sort of initial receiving stage is to be thinking in your head about themes in relation to the problem, and what's starting to cause some of those themes. So you're really trying to sort of make sense of a brief, in terms of a brief's quite functional. Here you go, here's some information. I think ultimately a brief in our profession anyway is around, I want someone to do something. I want a customer to do X, Y, Z. And generally there's themes that will input into that. And I think what you want to do is start to structure your thinking around those themes, those drivers. And I think that gets you into a good spot where you can start to sort of break the brief a little bit and have it make a bit more sense. One thing I will say is, in a briefing, say you're in a formal briefing process, you're in a pitch, or you're in a briefing process with a client where they've kind of called you in and sat you down with maybe other parties, I would resist the temptation to ask too many questions. Not that there's anything inherently wrong with asking questions, but a lot of the time they're not really answered. And then a lot of the time, they're sort of interesting things to know, but maybe aren't related to the answer. So be mindful of that. I think from somebody who has in the past, and I'll own this, sort of ask questions to show eagerness. I think sometimes that can be lost. And someone can think, this guy's asking me a whole bunch of questions. I don't know sort of off the top of my head the answers to them. He's giving me more work. Sometimes I'd sort of say, okay, what do I really have to know? And it's likely you're going to have to go back to your desk and have a think about that. And then you'll have opportunities, I think, to get that information. But don't be the person that's like, here you go, here's 15 questions. Unless they're just super, super important in order to progress. So once you've got the brief and you're at your desk, what the first step of momentum is about basically creating what I'd call a brief, right? Which is really basically spending 2 hours on articulating what the problem is. And I call it a brief because when you see this as a format, it's pretty short. And it's something you could easily probably phone in and just sort of bang out 3 paragraphs. But this plays like a central role as things go on. So getting this right is really important. It's the first part of the solution. If you think about all the people you need to speak to, I think personally much better to be able to give them a brief, concise articulation of the problem rather than here you go, here's the brief, here you go, here's a whole bunch of other information and get them to sort of source through it. I think ultimately sort of going, what is the problem? What do we need to solve for? And that's super important. Use a situation, complication, question format. So we don't have the answer at this stage and we're not expecting you to have the answer in the first 2 hours. But I think using this format basically gives you a logical, sequential step of what the current state is, what's causing the wrinkle, what's causing the issue, what the question is that you have to answer. And I think if you get the question right, the answer sort of can present. If you get the question wrong, the answer will be wrong. So you have to sort of nail these things sequentially for the next stage to be correct. So I think 2 hours on this, super important. Like I said, the complication is critical because it outlines the reasons why these actions are required. And I think that's, at the absolute heart. Can you nail that in 2 sentences, 3 sentences? Because you can't have a complication that's set 10 paragraphs. You need a complication, a specific or 2 specific areas. I think you've got more than that. You're trying to sort of solve too many things. You maybe don't exactly know specifically what the issue is that you need to focus on. The last part is a big field here, which is really what I've just called important context. This is where you can just write a whole bunch of stuff down that you think is interesting, and I'll show you in the example kind of what I mean by this. Important context is often, as the name implies, it's really important. It's the stuff that can be missed unless you give it somewhere to live. But the way I think about it is, you often see people with formal pieces of paper in their documents. There's a whole bunch of interesting stuff they've written around it in pen. That's the important context, right? And generally only they have that. That's just sort of this pen stuff. It's sort of things they've thought about and it's sort of written around the place. I think if you can find a way to get that important context documented, then that can help inform other people who aren't exposed to that. So that's distilling the problem. If you can get this done in 2 hours, you've got a much punchier, tighter brief. You haven't had to reverse brief. You haven't had to go back with 100 questions. You haven't had to go and say, oh, here's a whole bunch of things I don't know. You've got a pretty good understanding of what's going on. So a bit of a pause here. To illustrate this momentum process, I've created a client that's called B2B Co. They're what they are the fictional, practical client that is used as the example across all of these materials. So in the materials and all the templates, there's the blank template, and then there's going to be the B2B Co example. And the reason why this has been done is generally if you see an example of something that's been filled out well, or at least an attempt has been made to articulate something using a template, it's a really good way of giving you the kind of guidance to do it rather than someone spending a whole bunch of time trying to talk around it on there. So I admittedly am doing that right now, but what I'm hoping is by getting the explanation of why these things are in there, being able to see a practical example means you can kind of get straight to it, and you can go to work on that. So B2B Co, fictional company, used across the board. B2B Co is a business software platform. It focuses on small and medium enterprises. It's a super competitive category, and B2B Co is established. In this example, they've got a great marketing team. They're super engaged. They will do all the steer codes in the world. They'll be very candid around what the challenges are. They've got good market research. They've got good understanding of who their customer is. And they want to be involved in solving the problem. They've got a ton to offer. So really great client. They have a clear problem. So there's a clear articulated problem around generating X amount of sales. In this case, it's 20,000 sales. They've got a clear time period of 4 months. They've also got a clear offer. And they have, you buy it entirely online. So in terms of distribution, in terms of point of sale, pretty simple. In terms of offer, the offer is set. So it resists the need to question whether it's the right offer or question whether the pricing's correct or da-da-da. In this instance, the pricing is what it is. The offer is what it is. And in most cases, I think that is the way it works. So that's B2B Co. So every time you see B2B Co, this is as much sort of information as I'll give on it. Like I say, it's a fictional client. So if you find holes in B2B Co along the way, or there's parts where I've kind of gotten the subscriber number wrong or the month period wrong, it's because I'm sort of making it up as I go based on the kind of archetype that's here. But I think more or less it does the job of what's required. So let's look at the brief that I've done for B2B Co. So we first start with the situation. So I've done a relatively simple illustration of the situation. So B2B Co provides financial management software to small and medium-sized enterprises. It's made significant product improvements over the past X months and wants to grow subscribers by 20,000 net. So that's 20,000 total top line minus churn out over a 4-month period through a competitive introductory price point. So there's a price point that's offered for, I think I've set it at 3 months, and it goes to normal pricing for the rest of the year and ongoing. So that's the situation. It shows what category they're in. It shows who the broad target is, and it shows that they have to sell 20,000 things over that time. The complication here is B2B Co is well known. It has comparatively high levels of awareness amongst category eligible buyers. So by category eligible buyers, what I'm referring to is people that have a need for what they sell. So if you don't have a small to medium business, or you have a large business, you're not in the category. So that gives us a relatively sort of fixed view of who that market is. It's unlikely that somebody who has a salary job is going to need what they offer. So we have a pretty good idea of who the pool of people who could technically have a need for it is. It has high levels of awareness, of unprompted awareness, that is equal to the market leader. So B2B Co is not the market leader. Something else is the market leader. I think they've called it the XYZ Co. So they have a higher share, but the awareness is the same. The largest issue that faces B2B Co is attitudinal, and it's linked to past beliefs about the brand that aren't based on recent understanding, usage, and or trial. So awareness is pretty strong. Attitudinally is the complication. And so that's really central. Trial pricing is set. So that's set. The user on board is fixed for the duration of the campaign. The budget is set at X million dollars. That's not necessarily a complication, but for the purpose of this, I've put it in there. I think the real complication is the attitudinal beliefs that are not the result of recent experience with the brand. So the question becomes, what level of incremental sales uplift on the base / residual sales is required to achieve 20,000 net sales growth over the 4-month period? If I break that up, what I'm trying to say here is B2B Co is making sales without activity. So they will probably sell, I don't know, again, this is a made up business, but let's assume they sell, I don't know, 3,500 subscriptions a month already. What we're asking for is an incremental net 20 on top of that. We're asking for 20 total. So basically you've got to kind of go, okay, what's the difference between what they're already doing in terms of growth and what we're being asked to do in terms of growth, because that becomes fundamental to what the challenge is. And then what is the optimum mix of audiences or target market, messaging, and segments in order to achieve this using the budget of X million dollars? So you've kind of got a multi-part question here. This is really early on, but in essence, this is the brief. If I go to the important context information here, we've got CEOs involved in process and we'll need updates. So during this briefing period, the CEO has been mentioned multiple times. We understand that the category has low levels of switching. That's important context. Some categories, like say health insurance or car insurance, can have high levels of switching, which means that when you are chasing new customers, that can be a really strong path to growth. In this instance, it's not. So you can't just kind of steal from somebody else, and that will become evident in the answer. First 4 weeks is critical for internal buy-in. So basically what we've been told by fictional B2B co-marketing is, hey, the exec kind of want results in the first 4 weeks. If they don't see them, they'll start to lose a bit of confidence. So for us, we become a default part of that group, and the thought would be, all right, we have to deliver in that first 4 weeks. So in the first sort of 2 hours, ideally you've just kind of nutted this out, and then this can become really your primary source. You've still got a brief, you've still got all the notes, but you've come out of this 2 hours with a clear idea of what the problem is, what the complication is. You've got all the important context. If you were to sit people down, you could probably pull this out and go through it, and they'd get 80% of the way in terms of where they need to get to. So brief is done, right? So then you kind of put that to the side and you say, okay, great, it's time for a gut answer. Now, a gut answer is really a top-down answer that you take 1 hour on using this answer on a page format that's just based on your first gut feeling of what the answer could be. And it's based on everything you know about the problem and the surrounding context. And I think it's important to note that in the majority of instances, you and your team will have tons of knowledge of a client, category, surrounding context. So you're never, very, very rarely coming in completely blind. And then the instances where you're coming in completely blind, it's really probably unlikely you're going to be able to solve the problem better than they probably could themselves. So in this instance, really the superpower you've got is you've got really strong understanding of the dynamics of the category, but you've got all this other understanding of why people do certain things. You've got all this other understanding of how other categories work. This is where external help is really valuable, brings new perspective. So a gut answer is a good way and the right way, in my view, to jump to generating progress. If you jump straight into information finding, which is sort of research, desktop research, you're kind of getting bogged down in more information, but you don't know exactly what you're trying to get that information and support. You're just kind of getting a whole bunch of interesting stuff, hoping it will lead you to an answer. I think is in this instance, if you start with an answer and you build that answer, if the answer's wrong, that's part of the journey. If the answer starts to become right, then it can save you quite a lot of time. So that's what I mean by sort of answer first thinking is, by doing this, it's not like, okay, spend 1 hour, get the answer, like kind of bang it out. What it means is just start to think about what a solution would look like really quickly. Information finding is super important, and there's absolutely a phase for that, but it's got to be purposeful and not directionless. Otherwise, you can just burn time and resource on it. You can find all this new stuff you didn't know that you think is really interesting because you didn't know it before, but it can just slow you down even more. So you're kind of burdened with even more information. I think in a lot of instances, it's better to look for information to prove a hypothesis rather than look for information, try and build something out as a result of that. Now, that's not going to work for everybody, but it definitely works for me. And I think this process is ultimately based on that. And that's why I believe it can get results in 1 week. So the gut answer is really critical. So you've got that brief 2 hours. In doing that, I think you've started to form like a really good distillation of the problem. You've got a whole bunch of understanding of surrounding circumstances. You're not that far from getting an answer. So, introducing the answer on a page process. So, you use this format for your initial gut answer, and then you use it as you go along and you're building an answer on a page. Now, it's not necessarily how you're going to present it to a client. You may want to use an answer on a page format. It depends aesthetically what works with them. But it is how you're going to try and get to an answer and prove an answer out. The way you choose to present it is really up to you, but I would urge you to use this format in terms of situation, complication, question, answer, pillars, rationale as the way to get there. Like I said, you've covered the situation, complication, question as part of the brief. You want to come up with an answer and write it in your answer field. So again, it's 2, 3, 4 sentences about what the answer is, and you're going to write it in there. Like I said, don't worry if it's right or wrong at this stage. The process is about getting something down on paper, and then seeing whether you can build a case around it being robust and credible. If you write something down and it's not robust, or when you write an answer down, everything has to be proven out. Nothing can really be substantiated. You start to sort of go, oh, okay, like this probably isn't it. Now you build out and substantiate it using the following steps. So you'll have, I like to do things in groups of 3. You'll have sort of 3 supporting arguments that create a case for why this is the right answer. And then underneath each of those, there'll be a whole bunch of supporting data points which validate that this is robust. So you kind of think about it this way. You've got answer, you've got 3 kind of arguments underneath it that sort of build upon why it is credible, and then you have a bunch of data that backs up that it's not just opinion. That's basically how it works. The 3 is effectively a version of the pyramid principle by Barbara Minto. It's a form of executive communication. It's great. And once you start using it, I find very difficult to go to anything else. It's again, this is a very functional visualization of it. But again, at this stage, this is not meant to be, whiz bang deck. Oh my God, it's amazing. It's meant to be, I'm trying to kind of get to the heart of the problem. So I'm looking at function, not form here. Think of it as walking someone through thinking. So logical, sequential way. So if you think about the situation, we're in XYZ is current state. You think about the complication. Here's the thing that's creating the wrinkle that is creating a problem for us. The problem can be expressed in blah. As part of the complication. You got your question, which is how do we effectively adequately address that complication, and then you got an answer which says it is addressed by boom boom boom. Then you have your points there. It gives you I think the right mix of being concise, data backed, and having to structure the thinking in a way that makes real sense. If you come up with an answer off the top of your head, it feels pretty good, but there's elements of it that you are pretty sure are correct, but you can't right there and then, validate. I think what you'd sort of say is, okay, what would need to be true? So let's say in this instance, I'm making this up, but it could say, running XYZ activity or running XYZ messaging is important or is part of the solution. And then one of the supporting arguments could be, in the past, running these at X period with similar audiences yielded us a sales outcome of X. You don't know the specific. You could sort of say, basically it would need to be commensurate with the outcome that you're already seeking. So again, I'll show you a way to sort of go with that. But, right at this stage, it's unlikely that you're going to be able to have everything sourced. But sometimes if I come up with a straight off the gut answer, I'll kind of put a statement in and sort of go, okay, that statement I have to prove that statement's true. Otherwise this thing doesn't hold. So it might be a case of doing what I'm suggesting will reach 2x the amount of people as alternative Y. And then my job is to go out there and try and prove it. So that's where, again, building a case. So if I use B2B Co as an example, I won't go into situation, complication, question. They remain unchanged. But I'll go into the answer. So my answer here, straight off the bat, is B2B Co must focus communication primarily on 2 to 3 core product features and benefits. It needs to, so that's the first part, needs to win in contexts related to BAS and GST reporting period, as well as financial management periods for SMEs. So kind of win in these contextually relevant periods. And it needs to focus media activity during SME owner downtime periods, and then identify potential churning customers and offer a price incentive to reduce churn. So that's an existing customer part. So that's probably not the answer. I can absolutely say it isn't the answer, but it was like the first kind of off the cuff one. Then we've got here kind of this argument. So in terms of the argument, what I've placed here is, okay, so category choice is defined primarily by 2 to 3 key features, and tangible benefits offer a clear way to demonstrate these. And then my sort of 3 supporting things are around this credible offering and the drivers, that I believe B2B Co could meaningfully be distinctive to buyers by focusing on these. And then the third part is that it can adequately combat attitudinal challenges held by category users within the campaign period. So that's my kind of first pillar. Second pillar, BAS and GST period are critical because they provide relevant context to establish demand. And then evenings downtime are a good time for SMEs because of the lower mental load during that period. So, then I've got my 3 elements there. You can sort of see running down. BAS GST periods are long enough duration. They represent a legitimate context where a SME would look to change platforms and then make the change within the period. And that these downtime periods for SMEs can reach a large volume of them at a time where they're not worrying about their business. So, that's the sort of third part. Third element is churn reduction is less expensive than gross new subscriber acquisition. So remember I had this thing saying we needed to reduce the amount of subscriber churn, so we needed an offer to keep these current customers from churning. And then these churn signals can be quickly established and monitored. And then sort of the argument was that users demonstrate churn signals and we're going to be able to find them. They're a big enough pool to contribute meaningfully to the net new target of subscribers. And then we can build a bunch of communication officers for churning users that will be sufficient enough for them to churn. So again, for that, trying to hit that net 20,000, if we focused on people not slipping out, that would be meaningful. So that was kind of the broad case that I built. But you can see here, you kind of got the 1, then you got your 2, then you got your 3, and they all kind of logically go down. So there's my first answer. So what I would do after I've come up with this answer, so now I've kind of got two sheets. I've got my brief, I've got my gut answer. I'm 3 hours in. What I would say is, hey client, I want to chat. Can I get 10 or 15 minutes with you? Just want to talk you through some really initial direction and thinking that we've thought about. The format's up to you, but for me, I would just kind of run through it and sort of show it up on the screen. Or if I was lucky enough to get in front of them, I'd just have it there and just be like, okay, here's my thinking, top to bottom, blah, blah. But the format really needs to focus, obviously, sort of primarily on the answer, and it needs to be concise. So if you go in there with 10, 20 pages, I think they're going to go, whoa, 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 whoa. Like, I just briefed you, now coming with more information. There's more mental load for me, not loving this. What you're seeking here is an endorsement. It's guidance. And sometimes you can use these sort of directional answers just to sort of cancel out things that they absolutely don't want. There's no, within reason, there is no bad outcome that can come from this. You're never going to go in there with a ridiculous, non-credible idea that they're going to kind of look poorly upon. You're going to go in there with a sort of relatively rapidly constructed mode of thinking that they're in a position to go, okay, I can see how you got there, but maybe you haven't thought about X, or maybe I wasn't clear enough about Y. So what it can do is, again, get you closer to the answer. So you're not going in there particularly holding this sort of firm thinking, oh, I'm really into this idea, really hope they're into it. I think you're sort of going, hey, this is kind of off the cuff. It's not, there's some background to it, there's some thinking, but ideally I want to get a bit of guidance. I think in this phase you will get a lot more interesting kind of snippets and notes to take out of it, because you've started to show progress. Often they might have seen some of this progress or they haven't seen it, but I think people are generally much better at providing color when you give them an example of something rather than if you just sort of ask them and it's kind of a blank sheet of paper. So this can be your opportunity to get feedback. Okay, you said you didn't like X. Well, can you give me an idea of Y? And then they will probably be able to give that to you. Okay, you seem to be interested in X. Can you tell me why that is? Or is there something you've done before or at another place that has worked really well? So the feedback will give you direction in terms of where to head, and it will probably start giving you a direction of how the clients thought about it. I think clients can be really diplomatic. They can brief and sort of hold their own personal beliefs away. In most instances, you want to bring those out because they're really close to the problem, and I think you want to get their thinking, and you want that thinking to influence you in a lot of cases. The other thing I think is, and it sounds cynical, but I think is really positive, is it shows to the client that you're kind of 24 hours out, and you're already working towards the answer. You've already put a whole bunch of thinking on paper. You're already having some considered conversations. For me, if I was a client, I'd be thinking, well, I feel pretty good. Like they have jumped to this. In a lot of instances, 24 hours in, they haven't looked at it. In this instance, I'm already being asked for feedback on something, or, hey, that looks like they've almost already cracked it. Isn't that great? So that's what I'd do next. The next stage is what we call immersion. So you spent your 3 hours on understanding the problem. You've got a rapid answer with a supporting argument. I think you're feeling pretty good about the progress that you're at. You've run the gut answer by the client. You've gotten some good feedback, some good context. So you're in a much better spot than you were in the day before. So this provides a good basis to spend the next 2 to 3 days immersing yourself in the problem and the surrounding context. I think in this instance, you're generally sort of going, okay, I have an answer down on paper. I've got some refinements. I've started to get an understanding of paths I could take to solve the problem. The immersion stage is all about then sort of working out how strong those paths are, and being able to start to make choices around the path that you choose to consider, spending the majority of your resource down. I think that the worst thing you can do is, generate 4 or 5 concurrent paths, try and populate them all, and then sort of hope that you can make a choice around which one is the best, or worse still, just put 5 different ideas together and hope that they look like one central idea. This stage will differ for most challenges in terms of the information that you will be looking for. And so in that instance, what I've tried to focus on for this is things that I think are, regardless of the context you're in, regardless of the part of the problem you're solving for, if you're solving for media or solving for messaging or solving for CX, these things can help. But like I say, it's not, oh, what about, well, you didn't show us how you did a media consumption thing, or you didn't show us how you did pre-testing, or you didn't show us. There's a bunch of things there that obviously can't generate everything for everybody in terms of, a session like this. But the tools that I always use that I think are universally applicable is driver trees, one. Secondly is needs, pain, gains analysis. The third is what I call current state sizing. You've got demand spaces. You've got segmentation, reconciliation. And then you've got the Rossiter-Percy matrix. Now, some of you will be, or all of you will be probably familiar with some of these, or all of these. And I'll show you the context in which I like to use them. But I think if you can do these and augment them with a whole bunch of specific stuff relative to the domain that you are operating in, you're getting really strong at immersing yourself in information. Driver trees are wonderful. They're a commonly used tool to understand the driver of an occurrence. What you do is you start with an outcome, and then you document the drivers of what that outcome is. So in terms of what are the contributors to that, and then those contributors will have things that contribute to those, and so on and so forth. And you start to get a really good idea of how you sort of break a problem down. There's numerous ways you can use it. I've used it in a specific context here, which is around volume. But you can use it in terms of options you can take. So it could be decision trees, it can be driver trees. There's a whole bunch of ways to use it, but it's a really, really good way to break a problem up. Drivers need to be MECE, so they need to be mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive. There can't really be overlap in the drivers. And a lot of really, really great consultants are militantly MECE. They are really good at having zero overlap. I'm not sure if I'm one of those. So there can sometimes be overlap. But I think in this instance there's not, but really try quite hard to make sure there's not overlap. If there's overlap, you've basically got sort of sizing issues that are created as a result. Or you've got things that start to interplay. And ideally you're wanting kind of mutually exclusive things that don't have overlap in terms of understanding those variables. Driver trees will ultimately demonstrate relationships between an overarching metric, 20,000 net sales goal, and then the factors that influence that. And by doing so, it can sometimes point you to the answer quite quickly. Or it can point you to the crunchiest part of the problem or the most material part of the problem. And again, we're trying to be really efficient. So there's no point solving immaterial parts of a problem and leaving the really material parts unsolved, because it's really unlikely you'll get to the number you need to get to. A driver tree that's supported by data will give you guidance, it will give you direction, and it will tell you what the most important elements are in terms of focus. So I'm going to show you a really ugly, I said before I wasn't a designer, and I absolutely am not. I'm going to show you a really ugly driver tree. But it's a good illustration, right? So I'll do some little notes here. This is my goal here. I got to get 20,000 new subscribers, right? I have 3 paths in terms of getting to that figure. I have new acquisition. I have winning back customers that used to be with the business who aren't anymore. And I have prevention of current customers churning. Those are my 3 drivers. I'm going to focus here on one, just to give you an illustration. And I've got my sizing here in terms of new acquisition. There's 1.7 million people who are, what I've said, are category eligible, who don't use B2B Co, right? Pretty big. There's less than 200,000 that used to be B2B Co customers who aren't anymore. It's okay. It's not huge, but there's challenges there. And then in the campaign period, it looks like there'll be about less than 10,000 that churn out. So that looks okay. But again, once we go into the drivers, we'll start to see some of the challenges there. Now, let's focus on new. So I'm over here on the new, okay? Now, when I look at new acquisition to B2B Co, you've got two parts. You've got people that are new to small business. And then you've got people that are already in small businesses, right? Of those who are new to small business, you've got some that need what you're selling. And you've got some that don't need what you're selling. Now, red is where the things cancel out. So red for this part suggests it's a do not pursue. If you don't need the category function of what B2B Co is selling, it's unlikely I want to spend the time and the resource in this 4-month period to try and change your mind so significantly that gets you into the category. So I'm going to focus here on people that need the function. Of those, some are aware of B2B Co. Some are not aware of B2B Co. Right? If you're unaware of B2B Co, there's a job to do there. There's not really any downstream driver of unaware to B2B Co. However, there are, if you're aware of B2B Co, some have positive, indifferent attitudes. And I've lumped them together because I think if you're indifferent, it's not necessarily negative. Positive is good, but I think negative attitudes, which is here, is it likely you can reverse those in 4 months with a price pointed offer? I think it's not. So that is a sort of out there. So really you start to look and say, okay, of new acquisition, I'm trying to get either new to SMEs who need the function, who are aware of us, who have an indifferent attitude or who are unaware. And existing SMEs, I'm trying to get people who are new to category. I think getting switchers is unlikely. If I look at win back, and I'll say really quickly on this because I don't think it's a particularly good path. Of people that you need to win back, they're either negative, they churned out for a reason, or they're indifferent. But they're not positive, I don't think. You don't generally leave a business because you love it. You're either indifferent, you didn't get as much value as you needed out of it, and you chose to make the call to exit being a subscriber, or you really didn't like it. So if you had a past negative attitude about B2B Co, I just think that's unlikely to be changed. I think if you're indifferent, that's really difficult. The other thing is if you've left, it's likely you're doing something else that gives you the same function now. So if you're indifferent, you're either dissatisfied with your current provider or you're satisfied with them. If you've left B2B Co and you're with XYZ Co and you're loving it, don't go after that market. If you're dissatisfied with current, the question then becomes, is it annoying? Like, is it just I don't like using it? Or is it critical my business can't function without it? So when I look at this as a whole, I just think that's going to be like a lot of resources. It's going to churn a lot of time. I don't see the outcome that's going to come from it. Current customer churn, sort of two things. There's people that are going to exit the entire either category or business. So they're sort of exiting either closing the business or they're exiting the category and going to using Excel or Google Sheets. That's across. Not going to happen. If you're switching to something else, you're either, again, you're neutral or you're a detractor. You're not a promoter, I don't think. Detractor, no. Neutral in this phase, not this time. So you start to see this is really probably when I do a driver tree, it's going to help shape the answer. So if you do this for any category, it can get you to a really good point where you go, oh, okay, if I just do X, then I'll be in a really good spot. Or sometimes it's a whole bunch of different things, but you'll find not all drivers are created equal. And sometimes just doing a driver tree can be all you need to do. So it's a good way to understand, okay, like bottom up, what's going to grow, what we need. The second part is needs, pains, gains. So needs, pains, gains is a process to help understand the buyer. Needs are basic; they're kind of functional needs. A good way to sort of illustrate this with needs, pains, gains, depending is if you think about just sort of like a drink, like a can of soft drink. The needs are refreshment, thirst, liquid. It could be temperature. It could be whatever, right? But it's basic sort of functional needs. Pains are sort of negative elements that could occur from making a bad decision. Sometimes with soft drink, it can be, bad taste or calories or whatever. And then the gains are sort of positive things that can happen from making a good decision. Tastes really great, huge amount of enjoyment, those sorts of things. So from a consumer point of view, you want to really understand sort of these three things and how they function. And you sort of want to do it across a couple of different audiences. And now in this sense, what we've done is use this, what we've created, this positive attributes function or this positive attributes field on the right, which is ways that the product of B2B Co addresses these things. So we'll have a customer profile, which could be SME, 2 to 10 person SME who doesn't currently have a business platform. And then, then we'll run through all the different needs. So this is the example here. So the example I've used here is ABN, sole trader, contractor. So this is someone who works for themselves, doesn't have employees, is doing some jobs, has to do some invoicing, has to do some tax payments, etc., right? So the needs they've got here are pretty functional. They want invoicing ease and reminders. They want expense management and GST treatment for that. They want dashboards and reminders on outstanding payments, and they want to be able to do it all on their mobile. They're their kind of core needs. So then I've put a whole bunch of product attributes here that B2B can speak to in relation to these areas. Then I've got pains, right? So the pains of making the wrong decision. Well, the wrong decision doesn't sync to the ATO, so it creates tax filing issues. It's hard to use, it slows me down, so it creates less time to be able to generate revenue, more headaches, a whole bunch of stuff I don't know. The setup is time consuming and again, kind of waste time, takes me away from doing what I need to do. I get it wrong, starts to impact cash flow because I start to lose track of what I need. I start to lose track of who's paid me, who hasn't paid me, because this system, I just can't get my head around it. So then I don't have enough money to pay bills or whatever else. And then the last one is it's just a waste of money and it ties me to a system. I'm now like kind of locked to it. I can't get out of it because like all my things are in there, and even if I don't like it, I'm stuck, right? So the pains are pretty significant. And then the gains are here, what I'd say, they're really broad and conceptual. So the gains are like, well, it makes me a better business manager, which is kind of hard to quantify. Reduces my accounts receivables time, so it makes me get paid quicker. And then it makes me easier to do business with for clients. That's, again, you probably want to make more sense, make it more real to the person. Because some people will probably not see the direct connection between a business management platform and these sorts of things, which are generally much higher order things. I've done another one here, which is, so that's the one customer, but not all the customers are the same. So I've got here a transport ABN. So as part of this immersion process, we've got a really good handle of who's entering SME, who's starting new businesses, starting new ABNs, and then what categories and what industries they work in. And transport's a really significant one. So here I've got needs are invoicing, expense management, BAS and ATO, mobile first, so they can do it when they're downtime between jobs. The pains are, again, pretty similar, hard to use. Will need expensive help to get it to use. All of my friends, my peers use the competitor products. Or my employer, say an Uber or somebody else, will have issues with it. Maybe they're not set up for it. And then the gains are, in this instance, feel like reverse pains, right? Getting paid on time. You flip that and say getting paid late is a pain. So whether they're gains or not, I'm not entirely sure. Not being audited by the ATO is a pain when you take the knot, the knot out, and then it's being audited. However, this process allows you to start thinking about the customer who you're wanting to do stuff with, and it starts to help shape messaging. You go, okay, what I can tell from research that we've done is these are really critical factors that people make decisions on. These are upsides that they believe are credible. These are downsides that they're trying to avoid. I think if you do needs, pains, gains in any instance, it gives you a lot of empathy for who the buyer is. And you can start to understand either that the buyer might behave really similarly across different segments, which has implications later on, or they might behave really differently, which means the segments are quite specific, and you need to delineate activity between those. So that's needs, pains, gains. Current state sizing is a quick reconcile of where a brand sits in relation to the category. It looks at brand awareness, total amount of category users, quantified customer base, current market share. What it's really aimed to do is provide you with an understanding of the prospective buyer pool, the size of the opportunity, and just straight off the bat, where the brand sits. The reason why I like to do this is because in a lot of instances, the biggest issue a brand faces is just nobody really knows about it. And then in some instances, that is not the case. So if you're working on a massive brand, a big supermarket brand, it's different. It's not necessarily awareness. It could be salience, could be attitudinal, it could be a bunch of different things. But in a lot of instances, the big struggle is, hey, we've got this really small share of the category. We've got all these people shopping the category that don't shop us. And you've got to kind of look at it and say, okay, again, like I said in the first session, it's really difficult to shop a brand you don't know of. Can guide you towards what the most important things to cover are. What you're trying to get a handle of here is ultimately, okay, is there a sort of top-down sizing issue? So what you look at here is basically you kind of got four boxes. You've got things on the category to the left. So you've got the category users total. So in this instance, it would be all small businesses who are under or who fit into the small business categorization of the ABS. That's what I'd say is the category. Reduce those who choose not to use a platform. So let's say half of them don't use a platform, then our category really is 1.1 is where we get to. Right? You got unaided awareness, total customers, market share. So I'll give you the example, that's probably the best way to show it. So total category users for business platforms are 1.1 million. The total customers of B2B Co is 200,000. The unaided awareness of B2B Co is 30%. Their market share is less than 20%. So straight off the bat, I can just do some simple math, which is, okay, there's 900,000 people, businesses that don't use the product. It's a pretty big pool to grab my 20,000 from. My unaided awareness is pretty good, but market share is a little bit low. There's got to be some drivers behind that. Maybe I need to think about what those are. And then what you would do in this instance is start to understand what's causing that quantum between those things, because that's probably where the problem lies. Not that unaided awareness and market share should always be linked, but if you have significant sort of unaided awareness, which is a tough metric to build, and you have lower market share, it may suggest that there's some opportunity in that area. So that's current state sizing. Now, if you do this in another way, and the category's got 4 million users and you have 10,000 customers, it can look like a massive opportunity. But if your unaided awareness is 2% and hasn't moved for 5 years, then that's the problem. The problem is unaided awareness. And it's unlikely that anything else is going to get better unless you would address that specific area there. Demand mapping is a sort of ad hoc version that I built of demand spaces. Demand spaces is a process used by consultancies, marketers, a whole bunch of people that identify situations and contexts that reveal distinct consumer needs. And what they do is get learnings from these distinct consumer needs and use them to inform a whole bunch of NPD, distribution changes, packaging, pricing, communication, media. A really good example for this is thinking about products like candies. For instance, if they used to be a chocolate bar, and that's a certain consumption, certain need that creates the demand, what they might do is say, hang on, but by using demand spaces, we've actually realized that there's all these other opportunities, there's all these other contexts for people to consume the product, but we either have to change the packaging, change the form, change the pricing, change the distribution, and you start to see things that start to get invented. So businesses like Unilever, Mars, P&G, really good at this. And that's how they start to broaden out opportunities for consumption and provide their brands with new ways to go to market, new places to generate demand. This isn't the case. The way that I'm using demand mapping here is not to find new and different ways for B2B code to repackage. It's really about looking at needs and functions and trying to find the intersection of those, and then how you can bring that out. So I think this is, again, another sort of customer empathy thing, which is around how can I understand when someone has a real need, pardon me, for what B2B code does. What is that need? What is that functional need that becomes evident as a result of that trigger? And then how are ways I can best message to create salience in that moment or in that process of research. So I'll give you an example as we go. I'm just reading this part. Okay, let me now go into the demand mapping framework. Okay, I'm back. So segments have got to be measurable, accessible, substantial, differentiable, and actionable. It needs to be all of these things, not just some. And a segment reconcile is a really good way to keep your segments tight before you burn too much time exploring or populating a segment cohort that has no real practical use. So here's a segment reconcile that I've done here. You can use this template as well. What you're really trying to do here is get rid of segments that you can't really use. And then what you can say is, hey, when I actually look at it, I can't do much with these segments. I've either got to tighten it up or I've got to refine it. So measurable. Can the audience be sized and quantified? Can their response and behavior from the campaign be sized and quantified? Okay, pretty clear yes or no. Accessible. Can the audience be accessed and at what ratio? So can only some of the audience be accessed? Can all of the audience be accessed? If you can access them, is it just them, or is there a whole bunch of other people sort of commingled with them? Is a segment material, and will success result in an actionable or noticeable business result? Substantial is key. You don't want to have a segment that is, again, interesting, but if you get a big chunk of them to do something, you just don't notice it. Differentiable, does the segment respond differently to other segments you're targeting? Do they have meaningfully different motivations? Are there drivers? Are there things that make them make a decision? Do they differ? If not, are they really that different? And then actionable is can we action? Is it realistic? Do we have a right to play here? So I've run these sort of two segments that we just went through there. New SME under 10, manual SME under 10. New SME can be sized. It's challenging to identify their response without understanding specific elements of their business and conducting entry surveys if they signed up with B2B Co. The challenge here, or the crunchy part here, is if someone signs up who's a new SME under 10 employees, unless we ask them whether they're a brand new SME, we can't absolutely say that 2,000 of the new signups were new to SME. There's no real way for us to do that. Doesn't make it impossible. It makes it require that quantification, which is why it's in orange. The accessibility is the audience can be accessed, but not at a majority addressable ratio. So it means here that there's probably some things we can do that just target a new SME, but in other instances, that a new SME is going to be part of a broader demographic. which means that it's hard in every instance to point just at them with activity. The other areas are strong. So yes, it's substantial. It's a big group. If we get it right, we will feel it. Differentiable, yes, they have different motivations for signing up, because their needs in terms of establishing a new business is different. Can we operate against it? Is it actionable? Yes. The manual SME is similar, right? So it's hard to identify. It's the same point. It's hard to identify a measure against specifically that manual SME unless you ask them, what did you use before you came to B2B Co? And if you don't know that, it's very hard to say. Of the 20,000 new people that came through, 4,000 were manual SMEs, and they have the same audience addressability problem. So in this instance, what I'd say is I think these are pretty strong. I think the orange needs to be tightened. And what this segment reconcile allows us to do is tighten that up. If you don't do this reconcile, and say you didn't tighten up some of those measurability and accessibility areas, you would find that down the track, when you're 5 weeks into the campaign, the segments start to become something you never speak about again. And you can't really say, of that segment that we really thought we needed to go after, we've got no idea what they did with it, which becomes not ideal. Roster to Percy matrix is super helpful for comms and what you say. So it's based on work done by John Rossiter and Larry Percy. It's been around since the late 80s. It basically recommends that the appeal of an advertisement should match the customer's purchase motivation or attitude base. So if you think about the work we did with the demand drivers, with the needs, pains, gains, we're really trying to understand the purchase motivation, understand the reasons why they do it, how important the decision is for them, what some of the risks are, etc., that sit there. The precursor to these attitudinal beliefs is awareness. So the Rossiter-Percy grid posits brand awareness as a necessary objective for advertising prior to attitude. What they're basically saying there is, if you focus too much on attitudinal things and the awareness isn't there, it's not going to generate the efficacy you really need it to. So understanding that the awareness of a brand is super key. And then they kind of basically split awareness into two areas. So there's brands that require brand recognition, which is where a decision is made at point of purchase. So, a really common example for us would be shelf at the supermarket. I may not be able to answer that Pringles, for instance, is a preferred chip of mine, but when it is presented at me at a good price point, I can make a selection of that in terms of choosing it over a whole bunch of other different things. So that's where brand recognition is super important. Brand recall is where you must remember the brand prior to the point of purchase. That means that, if there's a whole bunch, it's not unlikely that you're going to be sort of given a whole bunch of different options. You need to basically remember the brand, know that it exists. And in this instance, brand recall for B2B Co is really what you're after. B2B Co is not sold in a market or somewhere where you just simply need that recognition. So understanding the brand awareness as well as the purchase type will give you an understanding of how to communicate. So in this instance, basically you've got a matrix. You can see, loving the matrices here. You've got low involvement and high involvement purchases. And then you've got informational drive and you've got transformational drive. What they're effectively saying here is one is trying to reduce negatives. That's your primary drive. And the other one is trying to reduce or trying to accentuate positives. That's your primary drive. Now, there's no sort of hard and fast kind of formula of where something fits in. But what ultimately happens is it will change the way that you communicate based on what the type of purchase is and what the end outcome people are looking for is. Now, when we think about B2B Co, what I'd say on this is, and this is again where sometimes the experience of somebody or their own view and being able to build a case is super important, right? I would argue B2B Co is an informational purchase. It's a negative drive reduction purchase. The reason for that is that I think when you look at what people say they use business productivity platforms for. They are inherently functional. They are, things that reduce potential pains, invoicing ease, payments ease, accounts receivables ease. So they're very functionally driven. Now, the category can often play here, where it doesn't talk about those things. It talks about the transformational benefits of like running your own business. And that's the sort of interplay here that's really interesting. Is it's tempting to avoid the informational and go down the transformational. But I think in this instance, I don't know whether it's sort of earned the right to play there. So in a lot of instances, the category tries to play in transformational high involvement, which I just don't know. There's nothing data-wise to suggest that's the case. Or it tries to play in transformational low involvement, which is really the kind of vicinity of things like alcohol, soft drinks, those sorts of things. So I, for the purposes of this exercise, the view is formed that it comes in informational low involvement. So you focus on one or two benefits or a singular group of benefits. You state those benefit claims really clearly, really extremely. They've got to be understood by the recipient pretty quickly in terms of one or two exposures. It's not something you can kind of try and explain over multiple periods. You can look at things like problem solution format. So in the instance of X happening, we can address that for Y. People don't necessarily have to like the ad. Doesn't mean that liking the ad is bad. It just means that they don't necessarily have to like it. So using this Rossiter-Percy grid means that when we think about, so we understand the audience, we understand when they use it, how they use it, when they're triggered to use it, all those different things. When we communicate why we're relevant, we don't want to get that wrong. And if you start to use messaging that's maybe more on that right side, what you might find is it's just not aligned with the way that the person, consumes the category and their beliefs about it. It's not to say that every single person who is a SME is going to sit in that left top quadrant. Some of them might sit in the bottom right, but what you're trying to do here is play to scale. So by having that, you can kind of look at it and go, okay, I'm taking out of this that we need some, really focus on specific benefits. We need to make sure that they're really clearly stated, and we need to make sure that we do it really quickly. And we can possibly look at problem solution if we have the time to do that. We don't have to, but it is sometimes a good way to show, here's a problem, here's the way that we can solve it in order to aid with that cognition and that processing. So in terms of that immersion case, I go, all right, I use Rossiter-Percy, I can use it quite quickly, I can get a pretty good understanding. So you've done 2 to 3 days of immersion. There's probably a whole bunch of other things you do that are unstructured. So desktop research, specific audience research, what's everybody else doing? What has the brand done beforehand? This is not exhaustive by any means. There's a whole bunch of stuff that I would do normally that hasn't been demonstrated here that would be relevant to the problems I get given. But you may not have those. But in 2 to 3 days, you can get a really good kind of briefing together of how a category works, how a brand works, how it's working right now, what the opportunities are. And you can use those areas that we went through to really get an understanding of the customer, what they're thinking, what they're feeling, where the opportunities sit. Think about the driver tree that we looked at before. You can start to go, okay, I've got a really good understanding here of where the big game is. What does that look like? Ideally, this all gets you to a point where you go, okay, I can refine the answer. And so I'm going to go back to my answer on a page framework and I'm going to refine it. And I'm going to have better data. I'm going to have a stronger argument. It's going to be much more put together. And I can put this in front of the client and I can feel pretty confident that this is a really good crack at it. It may not be 1000% the answer, but I think we're in a really good spot that now it's more a matter of refining and tinkering rather than coming out with a whole bunch of different things. You want that candid client feedback at this stage because you want to validate whether the work is right whilst it's fresh. You want to be able to either keep going or stop and start again or stop it and refine. But again, when you think about it, you're really sort of 4 days in here. So it's not like you've burnt 3 weeks. You've burnt 4 days at best. And that assumes that all this work that you've done, has not been that valuable. It may be a case of the answer, the way you've interpreted a lot of the immersion was maybe a little bit off, which doesn't mean you've got to do a whole bunch of immersion again. It means you probably need to rethink about what it's telling you. Either way, I think for the client, they've seen you, let's say 3-4 days ago. Getting this information early is great. For you, it's great. I think emotionally, you don't want to hold this answer too closely, because I think again you're trying to build a case for it, but you're not trying to sort of defend it, if that makes any sense. The format you choose is up to you. You've built a bigger answer now. But again, that logical sequential delivery that outlines the answer up front is super key. I think you're trying to get to an outcome. You're getting to endorsement as quickly as possible. And I think if you build the answer on the page and you feel that it tells a pretty good story, that's where I would start. If you want to turn it into a deck, turn it into something a bit more visual, you can do that. But I'd say don't lose the sort of punchiness of what it is. And then you've done a whole bunch of stuff in immersion. Some of the temptation I used to feel, and I probably still do, is you found all this interesting stuff. You want to show other people that it's interesting. You want to show the client, I found this thing, it's really interesting. You're going to find it interesting because you're in the same kind of industry I'm in. Often it's not, or it might be interesting if they weren't trying to fix the problem at a reasonable rate of speed. So I'd say don't overload a presentation with supporting information. I think keep it in your back pocket. If someone says, how did you get to X? You can pull it out and say, well, XYZ told me this. Or this data point really kind of suggests that's correct. Or we found this happened in the past. But I think have it if you need it. Don't assume if I don't have it, everything won't look credible. Wait for it to be asked for rather than presenting it. Otherwise, it's going to be too long. And will take too much time. So, if we go here to version 2 of the answer, so my situation has changed a little bit. Situation, complication, question. So B2B Co provides financial management software. It needs 20,000 net new subscribers over an X month period. The complication relatively similar, well known, high levels of awareness. Equal with market leader, largest issue is attitudinal, linked to legacy beliefs, not based on recent experiences. Question is the level of incremental sales uplift that is required to achieve 20,000 net sales growth over a 4-month period. What is the mix of audiences, messaging, and segments? Pretty similar. Actually, I think it's exactly similar. The answer is not. The answer is B2B Co must 1. Focus its activity on new entrants into the SME area, as well as small, less than 10 people, SMEs currently not using any business platform during the time of the campaign. 2. Communicate across the campaign on 2 to 3 core product features and benefits to users that really drive usage, which are payments invoicing, expenses, and the business dashboard. And 3. Target activity in geographical LGAs with the highest ratio and volume of SMEs. That's my answer. Okay? That's been refined during information achieved during immersion. So one was, I found out low levels of switching. That was a critical part. I sized up the opportunity of new SMEs and found that it was about 400,000 annually, pretty significant. SMEs not using business management platforms is significant. It's 1.1 million. They don't need to be the primary driver, but if I can find the right moments to intercept them, that could be a meaningful contributor. In terms of features, what we've found was there's 3 key drivers of why people make choices. And if we look at the demand map, there's a whole bunch of needs that start to exist that rely on those functions, and those functions continually pop up. So being well known, being salient in relation to those functions is really critical. And the third part, which I didn't go into, is that small businesses are not evenly distributed around geographies. There's certain LGAs that are really, really big for SMEs. And so in a market as big as Australia, you probably want to start to concentrate down where required. And that's the decision that's been made. So looking at the supporting arguments and supporting data here, I have three pieces of three supporting arguments. So one is new small SMEs and non-category SMEs have low barriers to sale. They don't need to switch. And they have core needs that can be validated by the product that we have. I have three bits of supporting data here. So one is that the new SME provides constant demand volume. It's not lumpy. It's steady across the year, which is important because we have a pretty hard job to do in that period. There's no built-in buying blocker. So there's no built-in attitudinal buying blocker, and there's no built-in switching blocker, which are key things. I can't change those blockers. I can't fight against them. So I've got to find potential customers who have the lowest level of blocker in the period that we have to play in. The third part is lower residual negative attitudes. New SMEs and what I'd say a manual or non-category SMEs that are using an Excel product, they are unlikely to have formed negative views on B2B Co or negative views or positive views of anybody. So they're relatively sort of blank canvas in terms of their thoughts on the category, which means I have to spend a whole bunch of energy and resource trying to reverse potential negative views or reverse incumbent views. So that's why that builds the case around the small SMEs and the non-category SMEs in terms of, one, there's a large amount of them, pretty steady flow, no built-in blockers, big sort of painful switching or attitudinal challenges that sit there. The second one is that the functional needs are pretty kind of established, the payment, invoicing, expenses, dashboard, and they tie in really neatly to need states that we think we can use. And they can be communicated, we think, really simply to a low involvement informational occasion. So in terms of customer fit, we think that B2B Co has a credible offering that it can meaningfully communicate in a short period of time and can reinforce it across the entire sales process, including on the website. We think these can be easy to communicate and we can do a good job in terms of expressing them in a short period of time, which is probably all we're going to have. And we think it addresses the widest gap areas with the market leader. So as part of the immersion process, we saw that B2B Co has really, relatively high levels of awareness that are in line with the market leader. But when you start getting to views and perceptions around specific features, it starts to dip. So you're really starting to play in an area which is letting you down. So this can ideally turn awareness into a little bit more sort of purposeful salience around specific needs. The last part which we touched, which was the geographical focus, was there's a whole ton of LGAs in Australia. Less than 10% are basically where the majority of SMEs exist. So these become must-win for B2B Co. Of those 10%, 32 individual LGAs are 65% of all SMEs. So basically, we've sized that and said, okay, over the course of the 4 months, 65,000 new SMEs will be introduced into market across just these 32. If we can get a meaningful sort of higher level of share just in those, we think we'll be in a really good spot. So I think this is, again, personally, I'm going to say this is a better approach than trying to use share of market, share of voice. I think in that sense, the market is not distributed evenly. In this instance, there's specific areas that are must win, and there's a whole bunch of areas that are not must win. So you can go and try and win share in specific geographies without having to get into these sort of blanket share of market, share of voice type rules. And the reasons why we sort of built the case out to this right-hand side is, the majority of demand is there. We have not meaningful competitor activity, which we looked at as part of immersion, and budget-wise, it works. So if we were to go with a whole of Australia 547 LGA approach, the budget would probably be a little bit too thin. Now, in terms of these colours, green reflects what I'd say is what is true. These are absolutely known, watertight facts. Orange would reflect partial data support. These are sort of what would need to be true. So what we have to do here is probably a little bit more testing. And so if I was taking the client through this, I'd say, look, my confidence level is probably like a 7 out of 10 on these oranges. It's an absolute 10 out of 10 on the green. Like, this is undisputable. So we can sort of close the book on doing more work on those areas. They are kind of good to go if we believe they're right. What the client might say is, look, I really like the idea of the orange ones. Can you just get me a bit more? Can you give me a bit more information just so I'm 100% sure that's right? And then we would go into this refinement stage. So hopefully I've come out of this with the client saying, look, I kind of like what you're taking me through here. It feels pretty credible. It feels like you've thought about it. It feels like we can win. It links back to the problem that I've got. But here's some things that I need you to look at. So what would need to be true testing would be the next step, which is trying to really kind of stress test some of these. This is a sort of Roger Martin special, which would be something that sort of opens up problem solving. So what would need to be true really helps you ask, what would we have to make happen to make the things true that would need to be true to create the future? So sometimes you'll say, I'll give a bad example because it's sunny outside. You need to wear sunscreen because science has shown that if you wear sunscreen, it prevents X, Y, Z. Now that's a fact. It's absolutely true. There was probably a time where people had to wear sunscreen. You had to sort of say, well, we believe the sun is harmful. We believe doing this would mitigate that risk, but it may not have been sort of absolutely proven. That's a super clumsy metaphor. But when you're trying to create things in highly competitive areas, you can't just rely on what has been done in the past. And what would need to be true is a good way to sort of kind of get to a point where a hypothesis is robust. You've all probably heard of this 70, 20, 10, 70% stuff that 20% is like, whatever the middle part is, kind of experimental emerging, and 10% is kind of evolve, test, learn, evolve type stuff. What I'd say on that is, well, experiments for experiment's sake, if you don't know what you're trying to experiment for, are just a waste of time. So I think with this, what you're sort of saying is, okay, I'm trying to do this thing because I really firmly believe it's going to result in these elements. But again, big part is focusing on future possibilities, not just the past state. And you'll know pretty quickly as you go through what needs to be true testing, whether something can hold up to it and whether you'd be prepared to sort of put your neck on the line to validate it based on your experience and based on your knowledge. So I'll use what would need to be true for these orange areas. So one of the orange areas was lower residual negative attitudes that we felt and we believed that B2B co-attitudes would be more positive across these cohorts of new SME and manual SME and less likely to be influenced by legacy beliefs. That's really difficult to watertight get unless you're able to segment brand tracking into people that currently use Microsoft Excel for their small business management. It's probably not a question that's going to be in the segmentation. So it has to be somewhat of a leap of faith, right? So the requirement in terms of what would need to be true would be that, okay, users are new to the category and therefore have less reason to have developed strong views, okay? Do we believe that's true? What's our confidence? Well, in this instance, I've put it to medium. I don't know it for a fact. Feels on the whole right. I don't have anything to suggest it's wrong, but I don't have anything to suggest it's 100% right. The next one is attitudes can be shaped with the communications mix and a focus on the drivers that we've looked at as well as the needs relevant to them will create strong solution framing that will help. I've got a medium confidence level on that because I haven't seen the creative because the creative hasn't been built yet. But again, feels reasonable as a hypothesis. Requirement 3 is the approach being proposed will reach more of this cohort than the competitor historically has at similar periods. So the approach that we're looking at is going to basically get more of these new SMEs or manual SMEs. I've got a pretty high level of confidence on that. Based on the competitive data, I can't absolutely point to a specific thing, but there's a whole bunch of other surrounding contexts that suggest that that's a pretty robust view. And if B2B Co can maintain the price position, the current price position that's lower for a reasonable period, that will add another positive to the cohort, i.e. this cohort will respond favourably to the price position of the trial. And the confidence there is pretty high, given we know that for the manual, they are probably relatively price driven because they haven't, felt the need to spend the money in the past. And for the new SME, they probably have a current revenue base of 0, so they're not probably wanting to spend a whole bunch of money on it. So that will be a motivator to them. I've done another what would need to be true in budget fit. Now, this is a different one. I won't go into it in super high, but the confidence on these is high, but it needs to be tested in the briefing. Sorry, there was a pause there. I'm getting a little bit of glitching with my recording. So the confidence here is high, but you've got to test it in the briefing. So what that means is I need endorsement to progress with this, because otherwise I have to go back and find something that is absolutely watertight, or we can basically agree that we think this is pretty watertight, and the briefing stage will absolutely confirm this hypothesis. Client, are you willing to endorse this and let me go to that next step with it? That's sort of the what would need to be true. So ideally here you're trying to get that endorsement. Once the answer's been refined, we saw the refinement in V2. I think it's a pretty solid answer. Ideally, it gets endorsed by the client. It can progress to the next step, which means, hey, they're ready to go. Let's move this towards translation. If the momentum is carried, this should take basically like around 5 working days. That brief is distilled, answer developed in 3 to 4 hours. Then we spend 2 to 3 days in immersion stage. Then that improved answer gets pretty quick feedback from the client. Refinements can occur pretty quickly, and as they happen, and then within 1 week, we've probably got a pretty good answer on the page that is relatively robust, and at a level where doing more to it would probably be a waste of resource. So that's the real aim: is can you get a really strong answer in that first week? Because if you can, you're in a really good spot. And that's the purpose of the first phase. Now, I said earlier this is a long session. There's a ton of stuff that gets done in acceleration and coherence. So the rest of the sessions will not be as long as this. But getting this right is super critical. And there's just a lot of steps that get taken in terms of introducing them and explaining them. So to recap really quickly, when receiving the brief, listen, ask questions to open discussion within current topics, right? Reduce or resist the need to ask a ton of questions and just get a whole bunch of information, right? It's going to take you off task, off focus. Outline really quickly the problem statement as well as the gut answer. Try and do that in the first 3 to 4 hours. Try and do everything you can to not get a brief, go back to your desk and leave it. Come back to it 2 weeks later. The energy is gone, the momentum's gone, the client's probably wondering what's going on, and then you're going to have to sort of rush to the finish line. The chances of getting the best answer are probably quite low in that instance. Test the gut answer with the client. Once you've tested it, go into the immersion. The immersion can be a little bit more purposeful, a little bit more directional, because you've, one, got some understanding from the client on kind of what they thought of that initial gut answer. You've at least got a position of where you sit. You've got a really good understanding of the problem and you've framed it. Now you can actually look and think, okay, I can't find every single piece of information in the world, but I can find stuff that I think is going to get me closer to the solution and to the answer. Once immersion's done, it's about how you distill that into an answer on a page. Answer on a page is a pretty concise document. It doesn't mean it's a quick thing. It can take a long time. You can be building the answer as you go through immersion. There's no set way to do it, but it is an important thing to keep it to that 1 page and resist the temptation for it to sort of blow out into multiple pages. You've got your client steer code that happens outside of that, and you get that answer. So you've got another steer code on answer 2. You've got the refinement, the what would need to be true, the way that you improve that out. You might need a third answer if you need to, but ideally you get endorsement at that point. And you can progress to the next stage of translation. So you can kind of shut the door on the strategic upfront work and you can move to the strategic translation of it. And then bridging those two is super important and is part of the next part. That's it for me. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.